Thank you for the opportunity to be here and speak to you this morning. This morning, the topic I'm wanting to look at, or the title of the sermon that I've chosen for this morning is the Salvation of Philippi. And really, a lot of what we're going to be looking at this morning is what we can learn from that congregation at Philippi and how they live their lives as Christians. Now, the city of Philippi is an interesting city. It's a city that was named after Philip of Macedonia, who was the father of Alexander the Great. And the congregation here at Philippi is a congregation that was near and dear to Paul's heart. And we can see that with how he spoke to them in the opening chapter of Philippians 1, verse 3, when he says that in every time that he thought of them, he prayed for them, and he thanked God that they were there, and he thanked God for them and everything that they were doing. This was also the only congregation that supported Paul after he left his time there. They continued to support Paul throughout his missionary journeys, and this is also the congregation that Paul would put in charge of collecting the funds that would be sent to the church at Jerusalem. And that's found in Philippians 4, verse 15. We see that they were the only congregation to support him after he left. But this morning, there's four things I want to look at in reference to the salvation of Philippi. The first being, I want to look at some examples of conversion that happened in the city of Philippi. Secondly, I want to look at we are to obey when others are not looking. Third, we are to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. And last, we are to take possession of our salvation. But first, let's turn to Acts chapter 16, and let's look at a few of the conversions that took place here in Philippi. Now, in the beginning part of Acts chapter 16, Paul was wanting to go somewhere else, but he had a vision, and he saw a man, a Galatian man, standing there. And the man looked at him and he said, "Come help us. Come help us." And so, because of that, Paul went in to the area of, or the region of Galatia. And as you go through chapter 16, we see him coming under the city of Philippi. And in verse 14, he comes upon a woman named Lydia. Lydia is probably a woman that we've heard of many times before. She was a seller of purple. She was a very wealthy woman. She was someone that would have had great influence in the community, in the cities around her, because of the wealth that she had, because purple was a very difficult color to make, and it was not a common color. It was a color of royalty, one that was often worn by kings and by ones that were rulers. But in verse 14 of chapter 16, he comes upon this woman Lydia, and let's read here. "And a certain woman named Lydia, a seller of purple of the city of Thyatira, which worshiped God, heard us, whose heart the Lord opened, that she attended unto the things which were spoken of Paul." Now, one quick interesting thing about Lydia, we see here that she's from the city of Thyatira. Now, the city of Thyatira is across the Aegean Sea from Philippi, which is, Thyatira is actually in the region where Paul originally wanted to go. But he was constrained from doing that, and he was... the Holy Spirit constrained him from going there, and he went into Philippi instead. And here, he goes down to a river, as we see in, if you look in verse 13, Paul went down to a river. This was a place where they gathered to pray and to worship and to sing, because apparently the city of Philippi did not have enough men, Jewish men, there in the city to have its own synagogue. So they would gather down at the river, and they would sing and they would praise God. And so this is a perfect place for Paul to go and to start preaching and teaching to ones. Normally Paul would go into the synagogues, so this is where he would go, where all of them were gathering and worshiping. So he goes down to the river and he begins preaching, and there's this woman Lydia here, and she hears the things that Paul's speaking. And on in verse 15, she heeded the words that Paul spoke, and when she was baptized, and her household, she besought us, saying, if ye have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and abide there. And she constrained us. That word constrained means that she pleaded with us. She pleaded with them to stay with her. She was so grateful of the things that Paul had spoke unto her, the things that Paul had preached to her, that she wanted Paul to stay with her a little longer. She wanted to sit and speak with Paul and kind of show her gratitude toward Paul for what he did for her. And one interesting thing, it seems to be the common denominator with the brethren here at Philippi, and we'll see this also in the next conversion that we look at, but her and her whole household were baptized. Her whole household. This was not something that she said, okay, well, I'm baptized, I'm saved, and she went on about her business. No, she went and told, she brought her whole household, all those that were with her. She told about the gospel, and they were baptized as well. The second thing, or conversion I want to look at, is the conversion of the Philippian jailer. Let's get down to verse 24. Here Paul's been continuing to preach after he went down to the river, and he's going through the city. And at this time, there had been a woman that was possessed with demons and had been following Paul and Silas around, and she had been saying things about them. And the things that she was saying were true, but it's still not a good thing, not good for your image to have a woman that's crazy following you around. If you're walking around throughout the city, door knocking and trying to teach people the gospel, you probably do not want someone that's spent quite a bit of time in the psychiatric ward following you around and yelling things. It's not going to look good, and it's going to hinder the work that you're trying to do. So because of this, Paul cast out the demon from this woman, and the men that she had belonged to became upset with this. And so they went and they got the leaders of the city, and they got the Romans involved, and they ended up arresting Paul and Silas, and they would beat them and put them in prison. And that's where we are when we get into verse 24. Verse 24, who having received such a charge thrust them into an inner prison, made their feet fast in stocks. One interesting thing here is they were put in the inner prison. They're not just put in prison, the inner prison. So this tells me a few things. First of all, they wanted to make sure that Paul and Silas could not escape. They wanted to make sure that Paul and Silas were not going to go anywhere. They were basically in the very center where what we would probably call maximum security. They had their feet and their hands bound with stocks. They wanted to make sure that these men were not going to go anywhere. As Brother Young mentioned this morning in the class, whenever you're preaching and teaching the gospel, you're going to make enemies. People are not going to like the things that you're telling them, especially when you're telling them they're wrong. And very often this happened to Paul. Whenever he would preach the truth, he preached the whole truth. And a lot of people did not like that. They were not fond of Paul for this very reason. And so he often was beaten and thrown in prison several times. And here they threw him in the innermost part of the prison. If you watch much Andy Griffith, I love watching the Andy Griffith show, and I think it's almost a prerequisite to be a preacher to watch a lot of Andy Griffith. But in Andy Griffith, you have the jail where Andy is, and you walk in, and normally it's just right there, and you have Otis normally sleeping off his hangover from the night before. But it's not just walking there, and they're right there. And this was deep within the prison here. So they saw Paul and Silas as a threat here. Continuing in verse 25, and at midnight, Paul and Silas prayed and sang praises unto God, and the prisoners heard them. That right there says a lot about the character of Paul, does it not? He's just been beaten. He's had shackles put on his feet and his hands. And same with Silas. But what is he doing? He's singing and he's praying praises unto God. Wow, that says a lot. I know if me personally, if that had just happened to me, I probably would have been sitting there in the prison. I probably would have been down, would have been moping, thinking, man, it's no matter what I do, this just keeps seeming to happen. I don't understand. I don't know what else to do. I preach and they throw me in prison. I preach and they beat me every single time. But no, Paul didn't sit there and feel sorry for himself. He continued to pray, and they sang praises unto God. And a key part here, and the prisoners heard them. Those that were around Paul and Silas, they noticed this. They saw this. They noticed that this is different. These are not ordinary men. There's something different about these men here. They're not just sitting there. I mean, they've been beaten just for speaking. And they're sitting here in great spirits. It seems like that made a little bit of an impact on all the prisoners that were around them. Continuing on in verse 26, and suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's bands were loosed. And the keeper of the prison, awaking out of his sleep and seeing the prison doors open, he drew out his sword and would have killed himself, supposing that the prisoners had fled. So here we have the prison guard, the jailer, who's supposed to be keeping watch over Paul and Silas and all the other prisoners that are here, making a few mistakes. First of all, he's asleep on his watch. Now, I don't know about everyone, but I can imagine for most of us, if we fell asleep at work, it's not going to be a good thing. It would be nice if we could fall asleep at work, but our bosses normally don't look too highly upon that. So he's made this mistake here. He's asleep when he should be watching and guarding these prisoners. And there's this earthquake, and it shakes the prison. The doors come open. The shackles fall off their hands and their feet. And everything's dark. And the guard wakes up, and he can tell the doors are open, and he thinks to himself, oh no, I've really done it this time. I'm supposed to be here doing my job and watching these prisoners and guarding them, and they just brought these two men in here that they wanted me to make sure nothing happens to. They put them in the innermost part of the prison, put the stocks on them to make sure that they could not go anywhere. And now all of a sudden I wake up when I should have been awake in the first place, and it looks like all these prisoners are gone. And he's thinking, man, well, they're going to kill me anyways. I'm in trouble. I've already not been doing my job, so I might as well take my life. It's going to happen, so I might as well take my own life. But in verse 20, Paul cried out with a loud voice, saying, do thyself no harm, for we're all here. Paul stops him and says, no. He says, don't hurt yourself. He said, don't worry. We're still here. Don't take your own life. In verse 29, then he called for a light, that's the jailer, and sprang in, and he came trembling and fell down before Paul and Silas. And this is a man that he was this close to taking his own life. And these two men that he's supposed to be guarding stop him. You know, I don't know if there's anyone here that's worked in the prison system or not, but normally if a guard was going to take his own life, I can imagine most of the prisoners probably would not stop him. They'd probably let him go ahead and go through with it. And so this has got to be having an effect on the jailer, thinking a little bit. I mean, he's probably heard these two men, Paul and Silas, singing and praying. And so he's probably thinking, man, these men, there's something different about these men. Something special about them. And he falls down before them. He has that light, and he's shaking, and he walked towards them. He was that close to death. And these men saved his life, and he falls down on his knees before them. And he brings them out, and he looks at them, and he says, sirs, what must I do to be saved? That's the question for the ages, is it not? One of the most important questions that any man can ask. What must I do to be saved? And they said to him in verse 31, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved, and thy house. And they spake unto him the word of the Lord, and unto all that were in the house. So this man's apparently, he's taken Paul and Silas back to his house. Now he sees that these men are not dangerous. They mean me no harm. And so he's brought them back to his house, and Paul and Silas are preaching to this man more. And they're preaching the gospel unto him. Verse 33, and he took them the same hour of the night and washed their stripes. So we see some humility from the Philippian jailer here. And this is more than likely a Roman citizen. And these are two prisoners, two men that would normally be thought to be beneath this jailer. But he humbles himself and he washes Paul and Silas. He cleans them up. He bandages them a little bit after where they've been beaten. He takes care of them. And continuing on in the verse, and was baptized he and all his straightway. The Philippian jailer and all of his household were baptized. We saw that with Lydia. Her and all of her household were baptized. And the same thing here with the Philippian jailer. We see a bit of unselfishness from those that are in Philippi, especially with what we mentioned earlier in chapter 4, how they were the only ones to continue to support Paul. Paul didn't necessarily need them to support him. Paul was a tent maker by trade, and he didn't ask for support. He went and worked for himself while he preached. But the brethren here at the congregation of Philippi continue to support him. They have a humbleness and an unselfishness about them, especially when it comes to telling others about the gospel. Now, how many of us, if we were in this situation and we're baptized, would immediately go to our house and go to anyone that was there and start preaching to them and telling them about what just happened to us? And that same night, all of them be baptized. That's amazing. That says a lot about this Philippian jailer, does it not? A lot about his character. The same about Lydia. The brethren in Philippi were brethren that were of a high character. Now I want to go over to the book of Philippians, and we're going to look a little more at some things that are there. We're going to focus on verse 12 of chapter 2. That's really where I want to spend the rest of my time. Here this morning is Philippians chapter 2, verse 12. And we're going to look at this verse a little bit and try to see what Paul is telling the Philippians here in this verse. Philippians 2, verse 12. Wherefore, my beloved, as ye have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. This brings me to my second point this morning. And what I want to do with this verse is I want to split it up into two parts. I want to start with going down to all the way to that comma after the word absence. I want to put a separation right there and look at that in two pieces. But the second point this morning, we are to obey even when others are not looking. Now, let's read that first part again, what Paul is telling them. Wherefore, my beloved, as ye have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence. When studying this verse, the Stancliffe's commentary, Stancliffe makes a statement in his commentary that when the boss is away, the mice will play. Here in the South, we normally say when the cat is away, the mice would play. But you probably all know what that saying means. When the person that's in charge is away, especially at our jobs, we normally try to get away with a little bit more. We normally try to push the bounds a little bit and see what we can get away with, and maybe see if we can get away with not doing our job. But Paul says here that These Philippian brethren were not like that. He says they obeyed while he was there. But even when he was gone, they obeyed even more. Once again, that's speaking to the character of this brethren here at Philippi, is it not? That even when the one that they would have respect for, the one that taught them the gospel, the one that really got that congregation started there in Philippi, that one that would be normally standing over them saying, brethren, we're not supposed to be doing that. Do you remember what I told you? We probably all have that one person that keeps us in line, do we not? Most men would probably say it was their wives. Some of us, it would be our friends. But we probably all have someone that keeps us in line and keeps us accountable for the things that we do. And within the church here in Philippi, they would have had each other, but still, whenever Paul's around, you want to be doing the right thing. And they did. But even after he left, they continued to obey even more. That is amazing. That's a wonderful statement about those brethren there at Philippi. Blake Shelton sings a song. He says, who are you when I'm not around? When the doors are locked and the shades are down? Who are we behind closed doors? What type of person are we? Are we the type of person that we read about in the scriptures? Are we still living the life that we know we're supposed to live? Some of us can say yes, some of us could probably say no. But that's a question we must ask ourselves. Are we the person that we need to be just when we're here? Just when we're in front of all the brethren? Or whenever we go home throughout the week or we're at work? What type of person are we? Are we still that same person that all the brethren here see? Something we need to ask ourselves. But once again, here in the first part of verse 12, what a great lesson to learn from these brethren here at Philippi. That to continue to always be faithful. And I think they learned this quite a bit from Paul and being around Paul and the time that they spent with him. Because when you look at Paul and you look at all the many things that Paul went through as a person and through his preaching, and Paul was beaten with rods numerous times. He was stoned. He was whipped. He was shipwrecked. He was bitten by a viper. If anyone had a reason to complain, I think Paul had a pretty good case. Paul had a pretty good case to say, you know what? I'm done. He said, I've suffered all of this, and I've been through all these different trials, and life's been hard. You know, I've made some converts. I've told a couple people about the gospel. Started a few congregations. I think I've done my part. I'll just quit. I'll just stop. There's no reason for me to keep going. I can sit here and make these tents and it'll be fine. I'll be okay. But no, Paul didn't. What did he say to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 7 and 8? He said, I fought the fight. I finished the course. I kept the faith. That's Paul saying, I continued. I was steadfast. I never quit. Throughout my entire life, I went through all these trials. And I didn't quit. I kept preaching. I kept going. I kept living the life I need to live as a Christian and being the example that I needed to be. And we can see that example rubbing off on these Philippian brethren here a little bit, can we not? I think we can. I think they sat and they watched Paul and they really took to heart the things that he said, and they saw his example. And they said to themselves, this is how we need to be. This is how we need to live our lives as Christians. Paul's been through all this. Well, like they all knew about Paul being in jail. Some of them were probably even there when he was arrested. And they saw how he was. even through all that. And they followed that example. Now let's look at the second half of verse 12. It says, Paul says to them, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And then looking at this part, I want to break this up a little bit as well. And this is my third point. There's two questions that come to mind when I look at this part of this verse. First of all, what does Paul mean by work out your own salvation? And secondly, does this mean that there's some work involved? Does this mean that there's some work we have to do? Let's look at the first question. What is Paul talking about when he says, work out your own salvation? What is Paul telling them here? Paul's telling them here that it's your responsibility. God's not going to do it for you. God's not going to make you obey. He's not going to baptize you himself. The elders cannot do it for you. The deacons can't. Your mother, your brother, your sister, your father, your aunts, your uncles, your grandparents, they can't do it for you. He said it's your responsibility to continue to live the way that you've been living. You've done great up to this point. You've been obeying. When I was there, you obeyed. Even more when I left. But that doesn't mean you're done. It doesn't stop there. Because we know from studying through the scriptures that we can lose our salvation, yes? We can. That salvation can be lost. We become stagnant as Christians and we just hit a certain point in our life and just say, you know what, I'm not going any further. I don't feel like studying anymore. I'm just going to show up. I'm going to have my chip. I'm going to have a little drink, throw some money in the plate, and I'm going to go home and go about my business. No, there's more to it than that, isn't there, brethren? Paul's trying to teach these brethren here at Philippi something. Yes, you've been great up to this point, but that's not it. Keep going. Keep working. Keep doing the things that I've taught you. Because if you don't, you can lose that salvation. You can lose what you have. The second part, or the second question, really, is does this mean that there's works involved? And for this, let's turn over to the book of James. James chapter 2, verse 14. Now, James, really through almost the end of the chapter, you can read this, but I want to just focus on verse 14 for right now. But James wrote, and James is one of the wisdom books in the New Testament. And there's so many great things in the book of James. And I would challenge you all to, on your own time, go home and read through the book of James and read a few verses at a time and sit and just think about what James is saying here, because there's so many great things to learn from the book of James. And I know through studying the book of James last year at school, it really had a great effect on me, and it changed the way I look at a lot of things. But continuing on with the lesson, in verse 14 of James 2, what doth it profit, my brethren, though a man say he hath faith and have not works? Can faith save him? Can faith alone save us? Now, we could turn this into a lesson in all its own and spend another good 45 minutes talking about this. But we know through reading the book of Hebrews, especially Hebrews chapter 11, what we call a faith chapter, we see some different examples of ones there, Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham. But what does it say about them? It didn't just say that they had faith, does it? It said by faith, Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice. By faith, Enoch followed God. And he was one of only two men to say that he walked with God. The other would be Noah. By faith, Noah built the ark. He had never seen an earth, a flood of the entire earth, yet he built the ark. By faith, Abraham left the city of Ur, the great city of Ur, one of the most, really the Alexandria of its time. Left that city and went into a land that he had not seen before. He had never been. By faith, he offered his son Isaac, the son that the promise of nations had been made. With all these different ones, their faith moved them to action. It was not a stagnant faith. It was a faith that caused them to do something. When I read these verses, I think about Joshua chapter 6. Whenever they were going into the land of Canaan, they were coming to take the city of Jericho. In verse 2 of Joshua 6, God says unto Joshua, I've given into thine hand the city of Jericho. But it doesn't stop there. Joshua didn't say, oh, well, thank you. That's great. We'll just go on about our business and have a good time. No. They had to do something, didn't they? They had to go take that city. They still had to march around that city 7 days. And on that seventh day, they marched around it and they blew the trumpets. And the walls fell and they went in and they took the city of Jericho. Now, I could take my wallet and I could lay it here on the pulpit and I could say, Brother Young, I've given this wallet to you. And everything that's in it is yours. But if he doesn't come get that wallet, he doesn't have it, does he? If he doesn't come get it, if he doesn't take hold of it, if he doesn't take possession of it, I'm just going to take it and put it right back in my pocket. And it brings me to my fourth point this morning. We're to take possession of our own salvation. When thinking about this, I think about that question that I mentioned earlier, the question of the ages. What must I do to be saved? One of the most important questions that can ever be asked. The question that was asked on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, Peter had been preaching to the multitudes of Jews that were there and the proselytes that were there for the day of Pentecost to celebrate that Jewish holiday. And he's preached to them from the prophet Joel in Joel 2. And he quoted what Joel said there. And he told them what they had done to the Christ, to the Messiah. And those men came to Peter and the rest of the apostles, and they stood before them and they said, Men and brethren, what must we do? What do we need to do? We're lost. Help us. Tell us what we need to do. We want to know. And then with the Philippian jailer, as we looked at earlier in Acts chapter 16, verse 30, he went before Paul and Silas and he fell down on his knees and he said, Sirs, what must I do to be saved? And he's sitting there and he's shaking. And I can only imagine what it would have been like to be him in that situation and what all could have been going through his mind. He was this close to taking his life, and now he's knelt before these two prisoners, and he's saying, what do I need to do to be saved? There's something wrong with my life. There's something missing. What do I need to do? Tell me. Then I think about the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8. And Philip comes up to the chariot. He's reading from the book of Isaiah, chapter 53. He's led before the shearer, and he's mute. And from that verse, from that chapter, Philip begins to preach unto the eunuch Christ. And as they're going along, they come to this water, this body of water somewhere. I don't know if it was a pond, if it was a river, a stream. I'm not sure, but it was a body of water. And the eunuch looks at Philip and he says, here's water. What doth hinder me from being baptized? The eunuch knew there was something he needed to do. There was something missing from his life. Brethren, we need to take possession of our salvation this morning. Not necessarily just being baptized. If you have, that's great, but it doesn't end there. We need to be aware that we can be lost. And just being baptized and just showing up on maybe just Sunday morning or even Sunday night, and we might even come on a few Wednesdays. That's not all there is. There's more to it than that. John wrote in the book of Revelation to the church at Smyrna. He told them to be thou faithful, and you will receive eternal life. John told that church, that's not it. Continue. You're not done. Yes, you might be a church, you might be a body of Christ, the Son of God, but that's not a free ticket. It's not. There's a lot of congregations around the United States and around the world that seem to think this. Just because I'm showing up on Sunday morning, I'm giving, I'm taking to the Lord's Supper, my ticket's punched. I've got it made. No. The same goes for preachers as well. Brother Mosher tells us all the time, and he got this from Brother Gus Nichols. Just because you're up there in the pulpit preaching the gospel, that doesn't mean you're saved. Just because I'm a preacher, that doesn't mean that I've got a free ticket. I've got to do the work. I've got to live my life and be a Christian just like all of you. That's our responsibility. That's our charge. This morning we have the opportunity. If you have not been baptized, if you have not been added to the Lord's church, come in contact with His blood through baptism, this morning you have that opportunity. If you have, but maybe you haven't been living faithfully, you haven't been the example that you needed to be for those that are around you. You haven't been living the life that Paul and Silas did where others looked at you and they thought, that person's different. There's something different about them. I want to know why. I want to know why they're there. I want to know why they're not like everyone else. Brethren, the opportunity is here this morning to take hold of your salvation, to take possession of your salvation, to be sure that you know what's going to happen. Brother Young mentioned this morning, there's a lot of people that think that they're ready for the end. They think they're ready for judgment. But if it came today, they'd be surprised, would they not? We sing the song, there's a great day coming. There is a great day coming for those that love the Lord. But that song also tells us something else. It's going to be a sad day as well. It's going to be sad for those that thought they were saved, they were lost. Brethren, this morning we have the opportunity. Let's not be of that number. Let's not be the ones thinking that we're saved. Let's not be the ones that think, I'm okay. Be sure.